Nvidia absolutely has the most powerful high-end graphics cards, like a 4090 and now the 5090 coming out, but that doesn't mean they're the best value at the lower end where more people are actually buying. So Intel is jumping in with the Arc B570, and this is meant to cost $220. I have the ASRock Challenger version as a review sample, but what to review it against? I chose the RTX 3050. Now, why is that? Well, in the current 40 series, the 4060 is the lowest end desktop GPU, and that's still almost $300. And I think somebody looking to buy a $200 graphics card like the B570 isn't necessarily going to consider buying a $300 graphics card. It's completely worlds apart price differential. So if you go back to the previous generation, the 3060 is still, that's a 1650, don't know why that's showing up, but the 3060s are still almost $300. So we have to go all the way down to the 3050 to get stuff around the $200 price point. But with the 3050, there's two models. There's a 6GB version and the original 8GB version. You can go up to the 8GB version and still be around the price of an Arc B570. The lowest price model I can find available new right now is $200, and then there's models around $230 and $240, and then going up to around $300. The point is, though, that if I want to buy a brand new NVIDIA GPU around $200 to $220, the only real option to compete against the B570 is the RTX 3050. I have the EVGA XC version. I miss EVGA. Anyway, so that's what we're looking at in today's video. Let's go ahead and see how they stack up. And if you're wondering, but what about AMD? Stay tuned for a separate video with the B570 head-to-head against AMD price range competition. But NVIDIA is kind of the name brand that a lot of people are considering. So if you're considering buying the B570 instead of a $200-ish 3050, well, let's see how they stack up. And the answer is, at 1080p Ultra and Final Fantasy 16, neither of them do great. We've got a 40 FPS average on the B570, but that was crushing the 3050. If we go all the way down to low settings, the B570 is able to get up to about 50 FPS, and the 3050 is at 34, giving the B570 a 47% advantage and a 35% advantage in the 1% lows. But one reason why I'm including this game is, well, it's a recent game and I played it and it seems worth testing, but also note that neither of these GPUs is strong enough to necessarily get you 60 FPS even at low settings in the most demanding new games. But this is still very playable. We'll also test them out at 1440p. And we can see that at low settings, the B570 is not doing great here, but it is still beating the 3050. The main thing is, though, that these just really aren't the settings that you would use. So if we go down to using low settings with DLSS, as well as using XeSS, Intel's machine learning-based upscaler, we now see that the B570 is able to hit 50 FPS and the 3050 is hitting 39. That's a 28% advantage to the B570. Image quality-wise, I'd give a small edge to DLSS, although XeSS is close. I'm using the same internal rendering resolution on both, although those are named differently. If we jump to a less demanding game, though, you can see that both GPUs can play ultra settings in some games. Like here we're looking at Baldur's Gate 3 at 1080p Ultra and Baldur's Gate City. The B570 is hitting 76 FPS average. Looks great, and that gives it a massive 43% advantage over the 3050, which is only hitting 53 FPS. If we jump to 1440p Ultra settings, we see that the B570 is almost hitting 60 FPS. We're getting 55 here, and that's a 41% advantage over the 3050, which is only hitting 39 FPS at these settings. If we go ahead and jump into a more competitive title like Call of Duty Black Ops 6 and reduce the settings down to the basic preset because you're looking for a high refresh rate experience for a competitive edge, we can see the B570 is good for 111 frames per second, and the 3050 is good for 90. They're both giving you a decent experience, but it is 23% advantage for the B570. And notably in the 1% lows, the B570 has a 49% advantage at 88 versus 59. And that can be noticeable in terms of like stutteries and smoothness in actual gameplay. So pretty decent advantage there in the 1% lows for the B570. If we jump up to 1440p at basic settings, we can see that the B570 is good for 81 FPS, while the 3050 is only good for 61. 61 is certainly playable, but in a competitive game, you might be looking for more. And remember, we're already down all the way down at the basic settings, so there's not a lot lower you can go without adjusting rendering resolution. Also, the B570 has a 59% advantage in the 1% lows at 62 versus 39. Now, speaking of lowering the rendering resolution, we can enable DLSS and XeSS here. And if we do that, the B570 jumps up to 101 FPS versus 84 on the 3050. That's a 20% advantage in the averages, but a 40% lead in the 1% lows at 84 versus 60. Again, I'd give a small image quality advantage to DLSS, but XeSS of 1.3 looks very good here. And again, note they're using the same internal rendering resolution. In DLSS, a 66% per axis rendering resolution is called DLSS quality, whereas on XeSS in versions 1.3 and later, it's called ultra quality. So they have different naming schemes, but I'm locking them at the same internal rendering resolution. In earlier versions of XeSS, they were named more similarly based on the internal rendering resolution. So that's a bit annoying. But anyway, I caught it for you guys. Now, if we go into like an older AAA title like Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p ultra settings, the 3050 cannot hit 60 FPS. It's hitting 50. Whereas the B570 is hitting 83 FPS. That gives it a massive 66% advantage. And the 1% lows are 58% advantage at 63 versus 40. Now, that might give some headroom for some ray tracing. Well, if we stay at the Ultra preset, but then enable ray traced reflections and not anything else, it's still playable on the B570 at 51 FPS. The 3050 drops all the way down to 34, so big lead for the B570 at 50% lead, but I'm not sure it's worth the hit because we're now under 60 FPS on both GPUs. So basically, it's questionable whether ray tracing is really something you would want to use with GPUs of this power level. However, the B570 does still have a noticeable advantage. Now, if you wanted to turn on upscaling to make ray tracing more usable, I personally don't like upscaling at 1080p. I feel like it's just a little bit low res to try to reconstruct. You get a lot of little, shimmering and smearing, looks a little low res. Not my personal preference. But if you do choose to do this, the B570 is now hitting 74 FPS, and even the 3050 is up to 56. So I'd say these are both very playable now if you're willing to trade the image clarity for the better reflections. So either way, the B570 still has a noticeable lead at 32%, although that's certainly a smaller advantage than it had before. It's still a very large advantage. Now, if we go up to 1440p resolution, I'm not going to worry about trying to use ray tracing, but at ultra settings, the B570 is almost good for a 60 FPS experience at 54 FPS average, giving it a absolutely staggering 86% lead over the 3050, which is only hitting 29 FPS here. If we move on to using upscaling, the B570 is now able to hit 65 FPS, whereas with DLSS quality, the 3050 is able to hit 40 FPS, giving a 63% advantage to the B570. Let's go ahead and check out some more games. If we try out Ghost of Tsushima at 1080p very high settings, the B570 is good for maxing this game out, 66 FPS here. Whereas the 3050 is only hitting 42 FPS, giving a 57% advantage to the B570. If we go ahead and move up to 1440p at max settings, called very high in this game, the B570 is good for 51 FPS. It's very playable, but you're not over 60, so maybe you wouldn't use this. Either way, the 3050 is only hitting 30 FPS, giving a massive 70% advantage to the B570. And if you wanted to go over 60 FPS on the B570, you could enable XeSS Ultra Quality versus DLSS Quality, which again both have the same internal resolution at 66% per axis. The B570 is now over 60 FPS at 65, and the 3050 is at 42, giving a 55% advantage to the Arc B570. And again, I would say maybe small image quality advantage to DLSS here, but like I said, I do think the XeSS upscaler looks pretty good at these settings at 1440p. Let's go ahead and move on to God of War Ragnarok. I've noticed this tends to be an Nvidia favored game versus both AMD and Intel, but the B570 just has so much more raw performance that it's still winning, even though not by as much as it does in many other games. I had to go down to medium settings to be around 60 FPS here, but the B570 at 1080p medium is averaging about 57 FPS in this scene, whereas the 3050 is only averaging 47, giving a 21% advantage to the B570, which maybe doesn't sound a lot compared to the other numbers we've seen in this video, but that's still a pretty noticeable advantage. At 1440p medium settings, neither GPU is that close to 60 FPS. We're getting 46 on the B570 and 37 on the 3050, giving a 24% advantage to the B570. If we go ahead and enable DLSS quality and XeSS Ultra quality, which once again have the same internal rendering resolution, just different naming scheme, the B570 is now near 60 FPS, averaging 57. And the 3050 is at 48, giving a 19% advantage to the B570. Again, I do think there's maybe a small image quality advantage to DLSS here, but they both look pretty good. They're both machine learning-based upscaling. Now, let's go ahead and jump into Horizon Forbidden West. At maximum settings, which are called very high, at 1080p resolution, the B570 is over 60 FPS average. I'm averaging 65 in my benchmark scene here. The 3050 is only averaging 38, giving a massive 71% advantage to the B570. And the 1% lows are a 71% advantage as well at 53 versus 31. Now, if we move on to 1080p medium settings, the 3050 is able to almost get to 60 FPS. It's hitting 53, whereas the B570 is hitting 87 FPS, giving it a 64% advantage over the 3050. The 3050's frame time graph looks pretty spiky here as well. And that means that in the 1% lows, the B570 actually has an 87 FPS advantage at 73 versus 39. If we move up to 1440p max settings, the B570 is playable at 50 FPS here, although I'd probably shoot for a higher refresh rate target. Whereas the 3050 is only hitting 27, not able to even hold 30 FPS here. It's an 85% advantage to the B570 and a doubling of performance in the 1% lows at 42 versus 21. It's very likely that we're going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM here on the 3050, which is causing it additional issues. We see that the card with 10 gigabytes of VRAM is allocating 10 gigabytes of VRAM. With Horizon Forbidden West at 1440p very high settings, we could kick on DLSS and XeSS, and that brings the B570 up to almost a 60 FPS average here at 58, and the 3050 hits 38 FPS average, and that gives the B570 a 53% advantage, and the 1% lows are a 58% advantage. If we move on to Silent Hill 2, which is a big Unreal Engine 5 showcase, if you tried it, this game has ray tracing, so to be clear, games that had ray tracing, I did try it out. And I do it on top of the maximum settings. So if we go with the epic settings with hardware accelerated ray tracing turned on, the B570 only has an 8% lead, but neither GPU is playable here. We're at 26 and 24, so really you just wouldn't use these settings. I did also try kicking on DLSS and XeSS, even though it was 1080p, to try to see if I could get the max settings with ray tracing to be more playable. And it is more playable, but still probably not how you'd want to play it. I see the B570 with a 16% lead over the 3050, but that's only 37 FPS versus 32. If we go all the way down to low settings, that's the only way we break 60 FPS in this game on the B570, hitting 67, which still gives it a 49% advantage over the 3050, which is only hitting 45 FPS, and the 3050 cannot play this game at 1080p native resolution at 60 FPS. You have to lower the rendering resolution on top of being at the lowest settings. At 1440p resolution, but low settings, the B570 is able to hit 53 FPS, which in a game this slow is probably completely playable. The 3050 is only hitting 32, and its 1% lows are dropping below 30. The B570 has a 66% lead in the averages and a 36% lead in the 1% lows. Notice that both are a bit spiky on the frame time graph here, but the B570 does maybe have more frequent spikes, which is why its 1% lows advantage is a bit reduced. If we go ahead and kick on DLSS and XeSS, here we have the B570 reaching almost a 60 FPS average at 58 versus 37 on our RTX 3050, giving a 57% advantage to the B570, and the 1% lows are a 31% advantage. So Silent Hill 2 is an extremely demanding game. Now, let's go ahead and summarize these results. So here's a big chart with the averages compared, but these aren't the frames per second. This is the percentage differential between the two GPUs. So for example, if you look at this first line here, this is saying that in Final Fantasy XVI at 1080p Ultra, the B570 had a 43% lead. So that's how you would interpret this. Now, this is grouped by game, but I think it might be easier to look at if we sort it from biggest advantage to smallest advantage for the B570, and that looks like this. I think this is just nicer to look at, even though the games themselves on the left-hand side of the screen are now jumbled up, since I'm sorting by percentage advantage rather than game. Here we can see that the best result is in Cyberpunk 1440p Ultra, where we had an 86% lead. And the worst result for the B570 is an 8% lead in Silent Hill 2 at 1080p Epic with ray tracing on, where honestly neither GPU was actually playable. So in the end, the geo mean of this results is 43.5% average advantage for the B570. So conclusion is basically B570 has 2 gigabytes more VRAM at 10 versus 8. Can come in handy depending on the settings, although in these on this class of GPU, we've seen that in the most demanding games, you might have reduced settings. Still gives you a bit more headroom for, ultra texture packs and things like that, so it's nice to have. And it's 43.5% faster at roughly the same price. So that's a pretty massive win. If you want a little more analysis here, you're like, I'm just playing at 1080p. How about we throw out the 1440p results? So if you look at this just sorted for the 1080p results, we see that the B570 reduces to a 40.8% lead over the RTX 3050, which is still a massive advantage. If you're only playing at 1440p, and we sort for those, we can see here that at 1440p, it's a 46.2% advantage. So a bit more of a lead at 1440p than it is at 1080p, but both are over a 40% advantage for the B570, which is huge. And if you're interested in ray tracing, note that my game selection and setting selection here was not designed to test for ray tracing. So it was more that I chose some games, and if they happened to have ray tracing, I did try turning it on. The only 2 games I tested that had ray tracing available were Cyberpunk and Silent Hill 2, and in all of them, the B570 had a lead. However, that lead varies wildly. It's only 4 results, so it's a little bit silly to do a geo mean here, but it's a 25% advantage on average using these results. But it's literally only 2 games, and one basically at native 1080p and the other with quality, DLSS quality, XeSS ultra quality upscaling enabled. So the point is, in every situation that I've tested, the B570 has a major advantage. So it certainly seems like if you were considering buying an RTX 3050, you might want to buy the B570 instead. However, I do feel the need to bring in an important little side note here. After the B580 reviews came out, some outlets like Hardware Unbox and Hardware, is it Canucks? I was criticized on my pronunciation of that. I'm not Canadian, guys. Anyway, had some results showing that on lower-end CPUs, it seems like, well, not just on lower-end CPUs, but it seems like Intel drivers have larger CPU overhead, which means that on lower-end CPUs, you can occasionally run into CPU-limited performance on Arc GPUs before you run into it on equivalent AMD and Nvidia GPUs. So that's interesting. I personally did not have enough time to run through all of this testing on an additional CPU platform. So I'm hoping some other outlets maybe get you some results on that. So do always watch multiple reviews before buying a graphics card because different people test different things. So I'm just going to bring it to your attention that that's potentially something to look at. My overall thought, though, is you tend to get CPU limited at higher frame rates. And this class of GPU isn't necessarily pushing extremely high frame rates. So I would say that that's definitely something to consider, but maybe not a complete deal breaker, especially versus something like the 3050, where we're just showing an over 40% advantage overall, which is absolutely massive in GPU limited situations. So something to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that Intel GPUs do require ResizeBAR support. And on older CPU platforms, it's possible your motherboard BIOS might need to be updated to support resizable bar, and on extremely old platforms, there may not be any update for resizable bar support enabled. So that's just something to investigate on your own before buying an Intel Arc GPU. But in the end, I would say this is a big win for the 3050. However, versus the 3050, so big win for the B570. However, what about cards like the RX 6600 from AMD? These cost under $200 or around $200, and honestly crushes the 3050. I've shown that in other videos. So if you're interested in how does AMD stack up in this price range, stay tuned. I am trying to finish up that testing, and I'll get a separate video out when that testing's done. So stay tuned to the channel. Hopefully it'll be out later today. And I hope all of you have an excellent day.